going to be tying the copper john, and it's going to show some new techniques, and I'm not really good at tying this fly, so hopefully you'll be patient with me as we tie it. I've got a size 16 in the vise with a copper bead. The body on this fly is going to be made from copper wire, which is probably part of how it got the name Copper John. So I'm just going to get my thread secured onto my hook here, and we're kind of off to the races. Go ahead and clip that tag end off, and I'm going to take a look at this and make sure that I get my thread wraps back to about where the point of the barb of the hook would be, if it wasn't a barbless hook. And this one is a barbless hook. I either will mash the barb down, or I'll just buy barbless hooks, is what typically happens here. So this fly, we're going to start out with putting a split biot, goose biot tail on. Today I'm just going to use a gold color biot, so you can see kind of what those look like. And I'm just going to find 2 of them like this that look like they're going to do me just fine, and pinch them between my fingers. That keeps a hold of them. Then I'm going to use my scissors and go ahead and clip that right off. So now I've got 2 goose biots in my hand. And I'm going to tie these in one at a time. Some folks will do them both at the same time. I just have a hard time doing that sometimes, so to make it easier. So this is one of the biots. You can see that it's kind of curved this direction, this way here. And so I'm going to want this, I want the curve to be curved away from the shank of the hook. So I'm going to tie on the far side of the hook first. I'm just going to take a really loose wrap here, just to kind of hold it in place for a moment while I check the size and everything, and that's looking fine to me. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab my second biot that I cut off. I'm going to look at which way it is bending, and you can see it's bending this way. I want it to bend away from the hook, so I'm going to be tying it closest to me. I'm going to want it to be about, not about, but the same length as the first one. So we'll just be careful to make sure I get that length right. A little bit more. That's probably good right there. And I'm just going to pinch those together. Because I'm tying my thread up and over the top of the hook, it's going to have a tendency to want to pull that biot over towards the lens of the camera. So I try to think of that in advance, and then go ahead and tie that down just a little bit. Now, because I haven't just completely locked this down, I do have some flexibility now to make some adjustments where, you know, I might want those biots to be just a hair shorter. So I'm just going to draw each side back a little bit, just to get it to the length that I want it to be on this particular pattern. Now that I've got my biots kind of in place, I'm just going to go ahead and pinch them in the back to try to keep them from straying too far. But I'm going to just take my thread up the shank of the hook here with the biot still, the ends of the biot still in place. This is going to be a tapered fly. So I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of those biots to get myself a little bit of extra bulk built onto the fly. This is where the rotating feature, again, one of the things that I really like about the rotating vise is I can just kind of turn it here on its side so that I can get a much better look at this biot. I can clip that off nicely, then I can turn it all the way back around on this side, giving me access to this biot. I'm going to clip it off. So now you can see I've got both of those biots clipped off pretty close. We're just going to tidy up by taking thread wraps up to behind the eye of the hook, or the bead on this hook. And I want this body to be tapered, and because I'm going to be using copper wire to taper it, I'm going to be pretty judicious about the amount of thread I am going to be throwing down on this pattern. Especially towards the back. So if I make the back end back here by the tails way fat, then the front has to be even fatter in order to get that taper. So I really don't want that to happen. So I've got my copper wire here, and I just keep it in a spool, and I'm just going to catch this over here on the far side of the hook. In theory, this is an example of when you can see how that thread was jumping towards the eye of the hook. I needed to jump backwards towards the bend of the hook. So by spinning my thread counterclockwise, it's going to jump backwards instead of forwards, which you can see now, which will make this much easier to secure and get locked into place. So I've got the copper. Now I'm going to come back towards the back end of the hook. And this is where I'm going to be a little bit slow and methodical because I don't want to lose what I've got there with those biots. If you just start going fast, you're going to pull them completely out of position, which is not something that I want to do. And I also don't want a lot of thread wraps here. So I want to be really careful about just taking touching turns back here. I want bulk up towards the front. I don't want any bulk back here. So I've got my copper wire tied in. I've got my thread just about where the barb of the hook would be if this wasn't a barbless hook. And that's about where I want it. So you can kind of get a good look at it there. So from here forward, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be working on creating that taper. By just, taking thread wraps back and forth. I want this to be as smooth as I possibly can get it. So once I get the taper, I've got it pretty much where I want it. I'm sure I'll still end up with some gaps on the copper wire. I always do. But what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to give myself a little bit of thread, and we're going to throw in a whip finish. I turn to the whip finisher in this case. I know I've mentioned it in every other video as well. I'm not building a head or anything here. All I'm doing is securing my thread to the hook so that I can use my bobbin cradle, which I'll pull up and into place at this point. And then I can just let my bobbin hang over the edge, and I'm hands-free. And the reason I use the whip finisher is if I do the finger half hitch, sometimes I end up inadvertently getting my knot, my half hitch on this side of the bead, and that's not where I want it. I need that knot to be back here on the back side of the bead. The whip finisher just helps me be a lot more precise with that. So now we've got that ready to go. We're going to want, so now I'm just going to take my copper wire that's on its spool, and we're going to use the rotating feature, and I'm going to be really careful to make sure I get this first wrap exactly where I want it. I want it to cover up that thread, but I don't want it to mess up those tails. So from there, we're just going to begin wrapping forward, trying to keep that copper one wrap exactly and touching the next one. So the goal here is to try to not have any spacing between these wraps. there out of the copper, I'm going to go ahead and get my thread off of my bobbin cradle. I'm just going to put a couple of thread wraps behind towards the back end of the hook here, back on this side here, because that's wrapping now over the top of this copper wire to help secure it in place. And then we will just go ahead and pull this copper wire back and do a couple of wraps here on the other side as well. It's wire, so it's pretty much just going to stay in place anyway. We will use our helicopter friction method, where we put some tension on that copper wire while we wiggle it back and forth. That's going to heat up the copper wire, and it'll give you a nice clean break. So there you are. This is, we have now finished one of the hardest parts on this fly. So we've got our tails, split tails at the back. We've got our copper body going. So now what we're going to do is we're going to tie in the rest of the materials to build this fly. And this is a really good example, and this one is a lot more forgiving, of why you need to be really careful with your thread wraps and not necessarily put too many of them down. So because we're going to be tying on so much material, so many different materials here, that's where you'll end up crowding the eye of the hook. I'll show that to you when we get to the end of this fly. The bead will keep that from being much of a problem on this particular pattern. But this is also where you need to think ahead a little bit, and you've got to think of the order of what you want to tie on, and the order is going to be dictated by what you want wrapped over the top of something else. So the very last thing that I'm going to tie on, or not tie on, but to fold over and add to the hook, is going to be this tinsel, this pearl mylar tinsel. So I'm putting it on first, knowing it's going to be the last thing that I'm going to be working on with this fly. This is great material. Most importantly here is I want to make sure that I get that centered over the back of the fly. And keep in mind, this stuff is incredibly slippery, so it can be hard to tie with a little bit. But I've got it pretty much locked in place. Again, I tied it in first because it's the last thing that I'm going to be using, using on this particular fly. The next thing that we'll be using is some nymph skin, and we're going to use this black nymph skin. And really, the only reason I'm tying this in is to give that mylar the ability to shine. It's going to be kind of the backdrop to that mylar. And you can see that I've cut a little bit of an angle on that. That just helps me kind of tie this in a little bit easier. We're going to give our thread that wrap spin counterclockwise so that we can get that to lay backwards instead of forwards. We'll go ahead and just put really, really loose here because I want to draw some of that back. And if I pull tight, this is elasticy stuff, and it'll just stay right in place. Okay, I've got it about where I want it, so now I can just kind of go crazy with it if I want to. I put a lot of pressure. Again, another material that I want to be going straight down the back of the hook, or the top of the hook here. So I've kind of got it in place where I want it. And then the next thing we're going to tie in are going to be some peacock curls to give us a nice kind of chunky thorax on this pattern. So that's what I mean. This is an example of a fly where we're actually putting on 4 different materials. We're tying on 4 different materials at the very end of this fly. Right in this area right here. So you've got to be really careful because each material you tie on, you're going to secure it with your thread. And so each time you're building more bulk, aside from the bulk of the material itself. So you don't want it to get overly bulky, especially when you're tying a fly like this that has a lot of material just in this tiny little space right here. So we're good there. I've got my trusty peacock here, and I always keep peacock and pheasant tail are two materials that are almost always just laying right next to me because I use them so often. I've got those tips on the peacock curl fairly lined up. The tips are incredibly brittle, and so I'm going to actually come down a little bit and clip those. Not only to make it so that they're even to one another, but it just takes you a little bit further on the stem of this peacock curl, which will be a little bit stronger. You still are going to want to be a little bit careful with this stuff. This is not stuff you're going to want to crank on. So I've got my first couple of wraps there just to kind of make sure I've got it locked down in place. I'm going to go up behind the back of the hook, or back to the bead, the back of the bead, and then I'm going to go back up to where I want that thorax to start. So you see me all the time doing this. I'm shifting and rotating because that allows me to have a good glimpse of where that material is and where my thread is laying. When I get back to where I want that thorax to start, I do not want to put a lot of cranking pressure down on that thread because that thread will cut right through those peacock curls. So I'm just going to throw in a quick whip finish here, not to build bulk, so I'm not going to do a lot of turns. In fact, I only really need to do one here, like that. Again, it allows me to be precise and not let that not go in front of the bead. But it'll also let me hang my thread on my bobbin cradle and rotate my vise without unwinding the thread. So I've got my peacock curl. I'm going to kind of stand them up straight. I'm going to give them a couple of twists in my fingers so they twist together a little bit. Not a lot, but just a little bit, because peacock curl will have a tendency to split apart from one piece from the other. So I'm going to be really careful here where I want to make that first wrap and make sure it's exactly where I want. And then I'm just going to take more or less touching turns up until I get right behind the bead. Just like so. So now I've got it right behind the bead, taking my thread off of my bobbin cradle, keeping my tension on the peacock, because if I were to let go right now, it would just unwind itself. So I'm going to take a couple of thread wraps behind it on this side. So those thread wraps are going over the top of the stem of that peacock curl, and it'll help, and it will secure it in place. And then I'll pull my peacock curl back this direction a little bit, and I'm going to throw in just a couple of wraps on this side as well. Then we'll go ahead and grab our scissors, and we'll make this cut here, and just cut off the balance of our peacock curl. You can see now that it's made a nice fluffy thorax for us here. So the next thing we're going to do is I want legs on this fly, and for legs I'm going to use Hungarian partridge feather, and I've got a clump of them here. I would invest in one of these. I know it's not going to show very well on video, but I've got a full skin of a Hungarian partridge here. Lots of great feathers for different types of flies. This here is where the about the head of the partridge is, and the feathers I'll be using are these going to be these ones right in this area right here. So usually when I pull one out, I end up pulling 4 or 5 out, which is fine because I use them all the time, and I'll be using them for other flies. So here's that little bunch that I've already pulled out. I just need one of them. So I'm going to pull one of them out just like that. And I'm going to grab this by the tip, the center, where not the end of the stem, but the top of the stem. And I'm just going to peel off these really fuzzy pieces. They don't need to be on here. So we'll just pull those off like so on both sides of the stem. So now we're left with you know, something that looks like this. And the only reason I pull them off is just a little bit easier to work with those fuzzy things off. The next thing that I'm going to do is I want to cut a little V out of the center of this partridge feather. And to do that, I usually will just take my scissors really gently and carefully and kind of start sticking them through that feather. And basically what I've done now is I cut that center part off, and now I've got a notch. And these fibers here are going to become the legs of this fly. Okay, so here I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to get those legs about where I want them. I'm going to pinch them against the body of the fly. I'm going to take a loose wrap behind the bead, put over the top, and then I'm going to take a look and see, is that where I want them? That's starting to look better in terms of what I want for the legs on this fly. They're still a tiny little bit long, so I can actually, because I've only used a couple loose wraps, I can actually take my fingers and pinch it and very carefully pull it back a little bit. And that will just tighten, give myself the length that I want on those legs. So again, being very careful not to take too many thread wraps. I did put a couple more down on that side. I'm going to fold the feather backwards over the back of the hook, and I'm going to take a couple of wraps of thread in front of the partridge, and that should help me get this thing locked down into place where I want it. From there, I can go ahead and grab my scissors, and I will just cut this extra feather off right at the bead, right where I tied it off, using my rotary so I can spin it around and get it in position that I want it in. And there you go. So now we've got kind of the legs in place where we want them. Our next step is I'm going to take this black nymph skin, and I'm going to pull it over the top of the bead, straight over the top of the bead. I'm not going to pull it really tight. I don't need to. The only purpose that this is serving on this particular pattern for me is to try to make that the pearl tinsel stand out a little bit more. So I just have taken a couple of wraps over the top of it. I'm going to take some wraps on the other side of it, right behind the bead, just like so. From there, I actually will stretch this a little bit. You can see how stretchy this material is. So I'm going to stretch it and clip it, and that will have it suck itself down right into those thread wraps, so you're not leaving much of anything at all showing. And then our last step is we're going to take our mylar, or our pearl mylar tinsel here, and we're going to take it and we're going to put it right over the top. So remember what I said a few minutes ago. I tied on first the thing that I was going to tie on last. So I tied the tinsel on first, but this is the very last material that I'm going to be putting on this fly. I want it to be right over the center, so I'll kind of turn it and make sure that I've got it exactly where I want it. I'll pull it down kind of tight, not tight enough that I'm going to break my thread, but get a couple of wraps there. I'm going to pull my mylar tinsel back a little bit, put a couple of thread wraps in here, and then I will be able to go ahead and cut this mylar off. Just like so. So hopefully you can see what's happened here, which is that I've got that black nymph skin just helps that shine through a little bit more on the mylar material. You can see the legs are sticking out where I want them. I've got my split tails about where I want them as well. And with that, we're done with this fly. We're going to whip finish, and we will call it good. But again, this is a really great example of one of those flies where you've got to think ahead, because you need to think about which material needs to go down, where, and when. And you also need to be very aware of not putting so many thread wraps in that you end up crowding the eye of the hook, because you don't want to do that. So I'll show you that really briefly here after I throw one more wet finish on here. Pull that thread tight, and we'll go ahead and clip that thread off. It's on the bottom, so I'm going to go ahead and rotate. Try not to cut off all my legs. Just like that. So what can happen, and this is what I would run into a lot when I first started tying, and I still do it from time to time. We actually tied in 4 different materials in this space right here. We tied in our mylar tinsel pearl, we tied in our nymph skin, we tied in peacock herl, we tied in Hungarian partridge legs. So we're working with a lot of material that we're adding to this, right to the small section of the fly. And if you use a ton of thread wraps as you secure each one of those, before you know it, your collar is going to be really huge, or if you're tying a fly that doesn't have a bead on it, you'll find that your thread starts creeping over into this area right here. And that's bad. That's not good. And I used to do it, and I still do it from time to time, but I try to be really careful about that. That's what I mean by crowding the eye of the hook. If my material starts getting too thick, it's going to come over. It's going to be hard to actually secure, because it's going to want to slide right off the eye of the hook there. But on top of that, you're going to be covering up a good portion of the eye of the hook. So when you get out on the river and you're getting ready to tie your fly on, you're going to have a devil of a time getting your tippet through the eye of the hook if you've tied your material too far over the eye there. So there you have it. That's the copper john. Quite a few new techniques to kind of show as we tied that. It's a fly I use quite often. Works really well. It'll hunt. It'll catch fish. Really good trailer fly, because it'll sink right to the bottom, because we've got a tungsten copper head or bead at the head, which adds quite a bit of weight to this fly, as well as a copper body, which is metal, which also is adding a lot of weight to the fly. So this guy's going to cut through the water column really quickly and get down to the bottom and bounce around. It's going to look like a Baetis or a Mayfly nymph. And I've had a lot of luck with this pattern over the years, and I hope you will too.